So my name is Yves Velart. I'm technical sales for Autodesk. I've been with Autodesk for 13 years now, mainly been focusing on anything and everything that is data management and collaboration related. So amongst other things, I look after the BIM 360 portfolio from a technical point of view. A couple of housekeeping rules before we kick this off. So you are all on mute. You will see that in the interface to the GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar tool, there is a sort of chat box where you can post your questions. I will try and look at them at the end and answer as many as possible. If we don't get round to that, we'll be sending out a follow-up with the answer to the questions. The session is also being recorded, so this will also be sent to you after the webinar. So if you want to review this or send it out to some of your colleagues, then feel free to do so. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get started on how we can take all of that information that sits within an AEC project, an architecture, engineering, and construction project, and take it really from design into maintenance and beyond, which is really the digital twin concept. That's the first thing I'm going to talk about. As I've mentioned, this is webinar number 4. So we've done a couple on BIM 360 design. So the entry to BIM 360, if you will, how do we get data into BIM 360? I will review this with a sort of overview. I'm not going to spend too much time on BIM 360 design today. We've done 3 sessions already, so we're going to cover some of the basics in BIM 360 itself. One of the key examples also is that data doesn't necessarily sit just within BIM 360. There might be things such as SharePoint or maybe Google Docs, and we need to integrate with some of those. So that's where our API comes in, and that's the Forge topic. So that's topic number 3 on the list here. And then at the end, we're going to be talking about some of the examples that we can have with digital twins. And then hopefully at the end, we'll get to some Q&A. So feel free to use the chat box to do that. All right, so off we go, digital twin concept. So essentially, what does that mean? Well, actually a digital twin, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, I would say. But essentially, the key to it all is that we're going to be leveraging the information that sits within the design, so within the eye of BIM, building information modeling, and we're going to hook it up indeed to all kinds of other information that sits within the company, but that might sit on the building project itself, so within the building itself, such as sensor information, etc. And essentially we can do 2 things with that information. Either it is to learn from historical data and to see how really we can improve on the design. And the second aspect is to indeed follow up on what is happening in the building or the infrastructural project or whatever, and make sure that we actually can control all of that information. Just bear with me for a second here. All right. So as I mentioned, so 2 aspects that we see within the digital twin, either to improve and learn from the data we've got from historical data, or indeed actually control the building. And we'll see a couple of things in those 2 spheres, if you will, in those 2 topics at the end of the presentation with the examples. Right. So that's the digital twin. So as I mentioned, it is sort of a digital copy of what is happening in the real world. And from an Autodesk point of view, there's going to be a lot of information that we get from BIM 360. So that's essentially what we're going to be looking at first here. So BIM 360, quick overview, a couple of slides, and then we're actually going to dive into the product. And I'm not going to do a whole overview of BIM 360. That would be too much, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things within BIM 360. So as I mentioned, what's at the core of a digital twin at this single source of truth? It essentially is the fact that we want to enrich our design data from start to finish. So rather than going through a traditional process where we chuck data over the wall, if you will, and send it on to another discipline. We want to make sure that everyone is connected to that same rich information, and that they can start enriching it even more, add more data to it, and that we get in a model that becomes more and more intelligent. Okay. And when I say model, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything sits into one design, one IFC file, one Revit file. No, it could be a combination of information sources, but essentially what we really want to have is a single source of truth, that the data is stored indeed in one location, and that we can benefit from that information from an analysis point of view. So that's essentially what we've been building over the last couple of years, which is that green line, if you will, where everyone connects to the same single source of truth and just basically enriches the data with their own insights and views on what they bring to the table in such a project. All right. So that green line for us is really at the core. It means that we've got a single source of truth, as I mentioned, which is nothing more than a data management solution in the cloud. Our project data sits there. And then depending on what discipline you're working for, we have some verticals on top of that. So essentially, we're talking about a common data platform, which is essentially BIM 360 Docs. And then depending on the discipline you're working for, be that actually as an architect or a structural engineer in the design phase, or in pre-construction, we want to understand whether what we're developing is indeed viable. So from a clash detection point of view, from an aggregation point of view, is everything okay? But then in the end, we're really going to go to the construction side. We want to do health and safety inspections, progress tracking, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this is indeed the remit of BIM 360, and some tools that sit alongside that, such as the assemble solution and plan grid, et cetera, et cetera. I'll touch upon those as well very briefly today. Then in the end, as I mentioned, we're going to go to handover and operations. And this is really where we're going to be talking about digital twin. So before we can get to that, and we've done 3 webinars already on design, we need to sort of bridge this gap, which we're going to be talking about in the next couple of minutes and this hour. Okay, so just from that phasing point of view, so we've got design at the beginning, so that's essentially BIM 360 design. Then when it comes to the constructability, clash detection, model coordination, that's BIM 360 coordinate. I'm not going to touch upon this one too much because that's going to be webinar number 5. So the next one, I'll be talking about coordination, and then BIM 360 build. So I'll touch upon BIM 360 build today a little bit, but we're also going to revisit BIM 360 docs in some of the aspects there. All right, so now that we've got this, let's actually dive into the solution. So I'm going to start with BIM 360 docs. I've got a couple of things open here for today, but essentially this is what we're looking at, BIM 360 docs. So essentially this is sort of Windows Explorer in the cloud on steroids, I would say. So there's a lot more to it than just the Windows Explorer. Yes, we can create folders. Yes, we can have security on it, but there's a lot more to it. And again, it would take us too far to talk about everything. Essentially, the point I want to make here is that we're looking at a certain hub. This is the environment. So in our case, it's EMEA TS. Autodesk EMEA TS. This would be the company name that purchases the solution, for instance. And then we can have a multitude of projects underneath that. So we're looking at a very specific project, which is called BIM 360 FY21, but we could have multiple projects that we're working on. All right. So inside of one of those projects, we will be looking at a setup of folders, right? So I can go in. This is highly customizable. We can set security on those folders. This can be done by user, by role of the user, or by company for which the users are working. So if I go in here, then one of the most critical aspects of BIM 360 in general is the fact that we have this, what we call large model viewer. So if I look at this file, for instance, office architecture.rvt, if I click on it, it's actually going to allow me to visualize that file without the need for Revit. So this is a cloud-based viewer, and it allows us to view up to 60 different types of file format. So this could be Revit, this could be AutoCAD, this could be IFC, SketchUp, Bentley MicroStation, SolidWorks, but also things such as Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDF, etc., etc. So loads of file formats that are supported by this viewer. So what does that mean? It essentially means that I can start communicating with stakeholders within the AEC project, the building project, or the infrastructure project. And rather than having to flatten and dumb down everything to PDF and send it out to those users by email, I can just make sure they're part of BIM 360 here. And without the need for Revit, without the need for AutoCAD, they can actually view this file. And it's a lot more than just viewing, you know. So if I go in here, I can start measuring. Let's say that I want to measure in meters, and I can actually say, right, I want to start measuring from this point to that point, for instance. Let's just close this down for a second. If I'm mistaken here, I can just pull at that and just go in, you know. Other aspects is that I can, for instance, if I go out of this one, I can start sectioning this model. So if I really want to understand what is happening inside of this building, I can do so. I can look into it. Actually, I'm looking at these different objects, so I can also select them. So rather than just viewing these elements, I can really understand what the metadata is of these elements. And this is quite critical. This will come back later in the story. So if I look at this column, it has all the metadata that comes from, in this case, Revit, but it would also show me the metadata that comes from AutoCAD, like the layer or the block name or whatever. It would tell me what the IFC characteristics are if it were an IFC file, etc., etc. So what we're looking at here is some form of visualization of essentially a database. And that's going to be quite critical later on because we can hook up all this information to other data sources. And that's really where this aspect of digital twin comes in. All right. Just to highlight a couple of more things here. So if I look at, I don't know, this door, for instance, so again, we get this information. We also get the model browser here, and this obviously depends again on the file format. In this case, it's a Revit file. So it's telling me, okay, this is a door. It's part of a list of doors. And so if I go in here, I can actually say, you know what, show me all the doors. And actually, I want to get rid of the sectioning here. So we're getting a view of all the doors where they're located. If I want to understand the windows, I can do so as well. I can reactivate everything. So as you can see, the interface is quite simple. So we can use this as a means of communication to just about anyone who's related to the project, right? And they'll get a clear understanding. This is like, if you will, not flying blind anymore. This is giving us a total understanding of this project, of this, in this case, this one file. There are many more inside of this project, and we'll take a look later on how we can actually combine them into one bigger aggregated model, if you will. The other thing is also that not just 3D, but we can also look at 2D. So all of the information that is inside of, in this case, the Revit model, but as a 2D sheet, it's also there. So what I can do now is I could actually go in here and say, right, I want to have a split view mode. And if I look at, I don't know, maybe this wall here, it's going to tell me where it's located in 2D as well, and vice versa. So if I was to go like, I want to select this door, it's actually going to show me this door. I can zoom out, show all objects. So there is that one door that is also selected here. I can look at the properties here, no problem. So essentially, again, a single source of truth, not just at the project level or at the design level, but even at the object level, if you will. All right, so I'm going to stop here with the large model viewer. There's, as I mentioned, there's a lot more to it. We can manage issues, we can do markups, we can have RFIs, etc., etc. Actually, you'll see an RFI here, which will come back later on in the story. But let's just come back here and let's talk about some of the other aspects that are inside of BIM 360. So what you see here is a filter, which we call document management, but there are many filters here. So we can actually look at cost, for instance. We can look at how people are going to collaborate from a design point of view. That's really the remit of BIM 360 design. Here's my model coordination that I'll talk about in 2 weeks' time. We've got a couple of things such as checklists and what have you, health and safety inspections that sit on the field management. We can do submittals. We can do RFIs. That's the remit of project management here. Again, too much to mention today. What I want to show you actually is one last thing, which is this this asset module that we've created some time ago. And essentially this allows us to manage not just view on a sub-component level or on a sub-file level, but also really manage those elements inside of BIM 360. So for instance, if I was to go in here and say duct fittings, for instance, maybe standard, I don't know, I can actually click on this rectangular duct. And what you'll see is that I get a listing of specifically those rectangular ducts. So you'll see the status, installed, specified, etc., etc. So I can go in here, this is an installed one, and it'll give me all the details. It also shows me a barcode, so I'll come to that in a second. But what it also tells me is that there's a Revit ID. So let's just copy this for a second, this Revit ID. So remember, this is a rectangular duct cross. It tells me that it's installed. This is actually where I would go and change the status, or I could do it on the iPad, which I'll talk about in a second. Again, all of this has a connected single source of truth. Right, I just copied my Revit ID. This is clearly an MEP story, so let's go back to document management. And I'm gonna go into my design here again, into my MEP this time. So we're gonna be looking at a different design of the project. So this is all of my systems inside of one file. So you'll notice that it says here air terminals, mechanical equipment, lighting, pipes, etc., etc. So it's got all the disciplines inside. So what I can do now is just go in here and say, okay, I want to have a look at this one and see this rectangular duct cross. So that's where this guy is sitting. So if I look at this, go into the properties again, then what you'll see is that it says rectangular duct cross, etc., etc. And interestingly enough, it also tells me data. This is the BIM 360 asset link. So I can go back and forth. I can click on this one and it will actually open BIM 360 assets. It will jump through that whole list and it will open that very specific item again with the very same Revit ID. Okay, so that's what we can do here. So as I mentioned, the whole thing around this asset module is that it is indeed connected to the design. There are a couple of ways of exporting that information and getting it as a list inside of BIM 360 here. But the main thing is that not only can we just specify the status of this thing, but we can also go in and create issues and checklists, put attachments on there. So if we have like, I don't know, a technical specification for this specific asset, and remember, this asset can come from maybe even an IFC file or a Revit file or whatever. And we have this information here. We can attach all of that rich information. So essentially coming back to my first slide, actually, where I said that we're going to enrich the data the whole time and follow that sort of green line. That's essentially what we're doing here. We're taking the information from the design and we're enriching it as we go along. And so, as I mentioned, this is really a single source of truth. So it's not just for a web interface that we have. So let me just quickly get my iPad up here. Okay, and so let's just go into my viewer here and switch on my screen mirroring. There we go. So I'm looking at BIM 360 Docs, the app on my iPad, right? And again, I'm not gonna spend too much time. You'll see exactly the same thing here. We've got design, we've got MEP, architectural, etc., etc. So within MEP, we've got this very same file and I can open this one. But that's not really what I wanna do. Let's assume that I'm running around on the construction site now. So what you'll see at the bottom here, if I can move this up a little bit, taskbar settings, just bear with me for a second, it's automatically hide. Okay. It's not really coming through, but there are some buttons at the bottom here. So what I can do here, and you'll see that now, is that I've got 3 buttons here. Like I said, it's not really visible. The middle one says assets. So if I click on that one, then I go into that very same environment with all the categories and what have you. So I can go in and say, right, let's do a barcode here. So let's say that, where is it? There it is. So I just hit that barcode and it will bring me to, in this case, this exhaust grill, which again has all this information. It still has that Revit ID at the bottom. I can actually go in here and say, okay, so this is now installed, for instance, or maybe this is ordered or whatever. I can put a checklist in here. So add a checklist, no checklist templates, so I'll need to define that. But yeah, I can actually add an issue. So in this case, test whatever, put a description in, etc., etc. So we can get all of that data on those assets and build this next level of intelligence, if you will. So I'm just gonna stop there for now. Stop mirroring. There we go. And so that's yet another aspect, right? So we can have those elements extracted from the design files and just really at an asset level start managing them, right? So next aspect, something that a lot of people ask about. So cost management, for instance. So what is cost management? This is, just to be clear, not quantity takeoff. This is really managing subcontractors and the understanding you have with the customer. So this is where all costs come together as sort of cost centers, if you will. So these are the different contracts we have. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this interface. The one thing I would say is that we have total control over the budget. That's what we agreed with the client, the building owner, if you will. And this is actually effectively, from a contractor's point of view, what we're charging. But let me just go in here. Excuse me for a second. There we go. Okay, so what we have here is then the budget, as I mentioned, and the expenditure. This is what we're paying our subcontractors for. And so what we have is the original budget. Maybe there are some transformations, like I'm going to push a change on the internal budget from one location to the other. Actually, we've got some pending owner changes. So these could be change orders. So if I click on that, what we'll see is that it's going to tell me, okay, so there's a cost element attached to this, additional wall opening, for instance. And what you'll see is that I can go onto that one, right? So this is already a potential change order and a request for quotation. So this is sort of the workflow to go through the whole process. And if we look at this from this point of view, it says pending owner, so 52,000. So potentially the budget is going to change from this minus this plus this to this. So that's how we keep control here. Okay. Which essentially means that we can start analyzing how our project and our budget is going. So I can click on my charts here and it's going to tell me, okay, so the original, the revised, and the projected one, so I can actually filter out, so I can focus on that one. Maybe we want to highlight this here or maximize this. So I can say, right, the original one, the revised one, we're deactivating that. So I'm now looking at the projected one. Maybe I just want to look at the revised one. Maybe I just want to look at the original one, or all three, right? So we've got this for the understanding we have with our client. We also have that for our understanding we have with our subcontractors. And how do we get those transformations in? Well, obviously everything, as I mentioned earlier on, is connected to one another. So if I go to my change orders here, I go to my cost items, then remember that one of those cost elements, the one of 52,000, which the one part was concrete issue 50,000, the other one 2,000. Well, actually, if I click on that, it's exactly going to tell me the same thing. PCO, RFQ, so potential change order, request for quotation, and then we get an owner change order, for instance, and a subcontractor change order. A request for a change order is the one here. And we'll see that again in that whole overview here. Now, if I look at my additional wall opening here, so it tells me that this is PCO number 3. So I could actually go in here and say, okay, so this additional wall opening, that's what we have here. Okay. Now remember that I said we had an RFI on one of the views. So an RFI, potentially, if the workflow went through and somebody indeed said, the manager said, yep, this is indeed a problem and it's going to cost money. Well, obviously, we can actually hook up the two of them. So if I go in here, it's going to bring me to my RFI module in project management, and it's going to tell me, this is the status. And actually, there's a document attached to it. So remember this office architecture.rvt file. So we can actually create those RFIs on a mobile device, have them reviewed by the manager. This is a problem. We're making it into a cost element and we analyze the cost. So that is really, again, that concept of enriching the data as we go along. And this is effectively that one RFI that we looked at in the past. It's still open, but as a manager, I could say, right, I want to move this forward or whatever. So I can put in submit an official response. Right. So that's my cost module. And again, there are many more. And the most important thing is all of them are connected to that very same rich information. And we're just building on top of that through submittals, through transmittals, through checklists, through on-site work, etc., etc. And this gives us a total picture of our AC project, of our building project, right? The last thing I want to show here then is with all that information, what can we do with that? Well, first and foremost, if I go into my dashboard here, so this is yet another view of the data. So this is my dashboard. What we can do now is just analyze all of that information and say, okay, how many issues do we have? How many issues are late, etc., etc. But we can take it even to the next level and really go into Power BI, for instance, right? So how do we do that? Well, there is a template to extract all of that information into Power BI. And so what you'll see here is that I have my assets. So this is the very same view. And what I can do with this link to the information and with the way I visualize it, I can actually go in and publish this information. This then kicks in on the Power BI website. And at the end, I can simply say, okay, embed, use this code here, and that's effectively the code that I'm using in BIM 360 docs. So what you'll see is that if I hit customize, go into my configure here, then that is the exact same publishing location, the same URL as what we had in Power BI in the cloud. And so, we can even take it down to the level of installations. So remember, we've got the assets, we've got all of that information in here. So if you look at all of that, all of those assets that have been specified and installed, so what you'll see is that I've got my air terminals, my ducts, my duct fittings, and I've split it out by cost even. So even those costs, they can be used as quantification, they can be used as percentage complete, if you will, which goes back into the cost module to start the payments of the subcontractors, for instance, right? So what I can do is I can say, right, this configuration, I just want to see level 1, so it's going to split out now on level 1, or maybe I do want to see electrical equipment. Now, I've split this out this way because these are the only ones that I'm installing right now. So what you'll see is that for electrical equipment, if I activate that, then you'll see that electrical, it doesn't say specified or installed. Actually, that is indeed blank. That's the orange one. And so that work still needs to stop. But at least we get like a total picture of what it's going to cost. That's going to be the basis for our negotiations, for our costs, etc., etc. Last thing is that we can take it even to yet another level, which is, remember that I said that we've got all these projects within our hub. So this is the company name. So what you see here is that I'm on the account level, so on the hub level, and there's also an insight module here, which is gonna do some predictive analysis. So based upon thousands and thousands of analysis that we've done in the past, we can actually say, look, according to the information inside of this very specific project, we know that this is, for instance, at risk with a medium level, and we can start analyzing that. But again, this is also customizable, and yet again, we can bring Power BI into the equation here. And this is going to give me a Power BI overview of all of the projects. So this is highly customizable. You want your logo in there. no matter what. You want to do specific bar diagrams, specific analysis across all projects. So from an admin point of view, a management point of view, that is totally possible. And the way we do that is within the Insight module, we have this data connector, which we can extract. So this is going to pull all of the information out of BIM 360, and it's going to store it as a zip file, right? And in that zip file, we have all these CSV files, which is going to give me all the daily logs, all the cost contracts, all the admin rules, everything that is inside of BIM 360 is going to be here. And the nice thing is that if you were to search for BIM 360 Power BI connection, it's going to give you this Power BI template for construction, which you can download. And that's essentially the second one, which is called Hub Report here. So with those checklists and everything, that is the very same view. Again, I can publish, I can get the URL and bring it back into BIM 360 docs, which again, you see here, this one. So again, to make sure that all of this data is up to date and now we fully understand. So we're getting sort of already into the understanding of the building as it's going to perform as we're building it. So this is already, to me, part of the digital twin analysis, if you will. All right, so with that, let's quickly move forward. So we've got all of this design information. It's moving through the timeline of the project and it's getting to the construction side. We've shown a couple of things with mobile devices, etc. So let's say that we're now ready to take the next step up, which is essentially connected to other data sources and move towards that concept of a digital twin. So let me just go back to my PowerPoint here for a second. And I'm going to move very swiftly into the Forge story. So we're going to use the API to connect to just about any database that is out there and that we need, maybe because there's other information in there, maybe that's an ordering system and we need to understand how this is coming through into our models. So essentially we're going to be using Forge for that. And Forge is the API of BIM 360, which essentially means that anything you do inside of BIM 360, you can automate it, right? It's a bit like the API for AutoCAD or for Revit. Anything that you think of that you want to do with Revit in an automated way, for instance, generate sheets automatically. And I'll get to that in a second because that's quite important actually also from a Forge point of view. Actually, we can do that with Forge on BIM 360, right? So all of the stuff that we do inside of BIM 360, we can get to it through the Web Services API. And that's really what Forge is all about. It's a set of building blocks which can be brought together to do some really intelligent stuff. And I'll show you some examples of what we can do with it. So essentially, it's like if you're building a spaceship through within Lego, it's exactly the same thing. We have these building components and we can do some intelligent stuff to, in our case, a building or an infrastructure project or whatever. Okay, so without spending too much time on the actual coding behind, obviously, we're not going to do coding here. Just a couple of concepts here. So Forge isn't one API, it's multiple APIs. And you see some of them at the bottom here. So we've got the derivative service, which essentially allows us to view files in the viewer. We've got access control, the oxygen service, which essentially allows us to log into the system. So there's loads and loads of services that we can use with or within our project. Okay. And then at the top, we've got some very specific ones for design, collaboration, project management, etc., etc. So these are the BIM 360 workflow modules. And we'd like to think that the #1 user of Forge is Autodesk itself, because indeed all of these modules, they have been built on that very same API. Right. So moving towards digital twin. So how are we going to use Forge, right? So there's actually two things that we can use it for. There's a lot more, but what we see people use it for is insights, understanding the data, and automation. So I'm just going to go through some of the examples here. So essentially, Forge is the connection to anything that sits within the company. You have a planning tool, you have schedules outside of BIM 360, you have an ERP system. On the other hand, you have all this rich information inside of the design files. Well, essentially, Forge can make the connection between those files and, for instance, an ERP system. So really Forge is there to connect all of these different company systems together, if you will. From a developer point of view, if some of you are interested to start actually developing yourselves, I'll get to that in a second, how that's working. But essentially, take any web developer that's been graduated recently, they'll know about all this stuff. We're not doing any rocket science here. This is all based on standard web technologies. JavaScript, HTML, CSS, React, etc., etc. All of this, if you were to talk about this to a web developer, he'll go, "Yep, that's exactly what I use on a day-to-day basis." All right, so insights. I'm just gonna give you a couple of pointers here of what people are doing. So this is Jay done in the States, I think it is. Essentially, what they wanted to do was bridge the gap with the architect, for instance. So essentially, if you're on a construction site, this is a construction company, right? And let's say that there's a delivery that's not gonna happen, like, I don't know, the windows are delayed by 2 weeks or whatever, and you need to come up with alternatives. Obviously, first of all, you have to run this through the engineering and maybe the architect or both to see whether that's gonna still stand if we're gonna do a design change so late. Those people will not be happy because this is like months after the original design has been approved, right? And so this is really what GE Dunn came up with. They wanted to do a what if scenario. So essentially it means that they've got the design and they're going to go like, right, what if we do the double glazing and replace it by triple glazing? What if the wood is going to be replaced by aluminum windows, etc., etc.? But obviously not just for windows, for just about anything. So they're using that viewer and they're hooking it up to their cost system and they're just doing what if analysis. So this is then being reviewed, and in the end, you get like alternatives that are really ready to replace if and when it is needed, actually. So that's one example. I did mention that we were gonna talk about development. So I'm not saying that you guys have to do development yourselves. Essentially, there are already a massive amount of developers that have been developing third-party tools, if you will, on top of BIM 360. So you'll see them here, and you can actually look them up on the BIM 360 App Store. We'll get to that in a second as well. Right. So another aspect, as I mentioned, the different services, you can also catalog them as what are they doing, if you will, in what aspect are they being used? So I mentioned insights. So obviously the data management API model derivative, which is going to generate the viewable and the viewer itself. Now, there is this second aspect, which is called automation. And there's two aspects here that are really critical, which is the webhooks and design automation. Webhooks essentially means that we're going to listen to a folder, or that the API is going to listen to a folder or folders. And if something is happening in the folder, he's going to activate code. And that code could mean activate design automation. So what is design automation? Design automation is essentially, in a nutshell, Revit in the cloud, Inventor in the cloud, AutoCAD in the cloud, and 3D Studio Max in the cloud. So that means that we can send a routine to Revit in the cloud and say, you know what, do something with it. So imagine that I was to have a Revit file that gets into BIM 360 in a specific folder with just a model, you know, just one basic 3D view with everything inside, no sheets, no 2D views, no nothing. Well, there will be 2D views, obviously, for the design itself, but not really any specified sheets. So what we can do is use webhooks to understand, oh, there's a new version here. So that new version kicks in and opens Revit in the cloud, and just basically, according to a set of rules, is going to generate the sheets automatically. And that's going to be my new version in BIM 360 docs. Okay, so this is essentially what Bouygues have been doing. So what you'll see is that they haven't used webhooks in this case, but what they'll do is they've got this model and just a 3D model, if you will, you know. And what they're going to be doing is saying, right, I want to have sheets and views for instance, the doors, and I want to have certain parameters like the type name. I want to have plan views, and I want to create the sheets according to a template. And basically what they're doing at the end is saying go. And that's what you see here. So translation. So this is now pushing this information into Revit in the cloud, into BIM 360 design. Into BIM 360. into the design automation. And what we're going to get back is a new version of the file with indeed all of the views inside. So that's what you see here. So all of these views, you can actually activate them and look at that. So that wasn't in the original file. This has been generated automatically. So that's one aspect of design automation. Let's move forward. Signify, just very briefly, this is where you can have a conversation with like a sales guy from a reseller of, in this case, Philips, for instance. And we've got this whole library of lighting fixtures. And just through the viewer, we can drag and drop these lighting fixtures in as one aspect, or we could look at a room schedule and say, right, this specific room, it needs 2 light fixtures or 6 fixtures or whatever. And it's just gonna build that automatically, right? And in the end, again, we can generate that new Revit file, open it up, etc., etc. So moving forward, last aspect here of Forge is that design automation. And this is really interesting because what you'll see is that we've got this one version of a Revit file with a table inside and a specific seating, right? This is a very specific Revit family. Now, this family comes from an Inventor part. So it's actually an export from Inventor as a chair. So what you'll see here is that if I look at this chair, that's exactly the same one, right? So we've just basically exported this from Inventor into an RFA or Revit family, imported it into or loaded it into the Revit project, and that's where we are right now. So what we're gonna do is, again, through webhooks, we're gonna upload, or I should say, we're gonna upload a file, and then through webhooks, we're gonna activate some code. So we've just uploaded a new Inventor file, right? An Inventor part, if you will. So automatically through the webhooks, it's gonna say, aha, there's something happening here. So I'm gonna start Inventor. I'm gonna open up that IPT part, and I'm gonna actually use that new part to make a second step, which is the export to Revit. And then in the end, I'm gonna open up Revit. That's my third step. And I'm gonna load my RFA, my newly generated RFA, into a version 2 of my Revit project. And so you'll see that automatically that seating has been replaced. So what we've done here is from Inventor, automatically we've got a new design and the Revit files get updated automatically. Right, so again, as I mentioned, those are the services. So I'm just gonna stop it there for a second here. And let's look at some more examples, if you will. So let's start with some basic stuff here. So let's go in and say, okay. So these are all kind of examples. So let's go in and use the model loader here. So again, we're going to be looking at the large model viewer here. And what we're going to do, people tend to ask me, can you aggregate multiple models? Is that possible? Well, BIM 360 Docs as such will manage those different files. And indeed, BIM 360 Design, as we've seen in the previous webinars, can aggregate multiple designs so that you understand what you need to accept and what you need to send back. And then there's obviously BIM 360 Coordinate, who can also aggregate models. And we'll talk about that in 2 weeks' time. But essentially, the possibilities are there. And so therefore, because Forge is the API which sits underneath, I can actually say, right, I want to load something. And let's say that I want to load a chair. So it's now basically loading that chair. So as I said, this is a proof of concept. So it's just basically showing a couple of fixed elements in the library. Again, the whole viewer is there. I can measure, I can look at the hierarchy, etc., etc. But what I can do now is say, okay, I want to have a second one, which is going to be, let's see, maybe table assembly. There we go. Right, and as you can see, well, that's not really nice. So we could actually go in here and say model chair and use this to move my chair, maybe rotate it. There we go. And so again, this is quite possible, as you can see. Let's just move this away. So we can indeed, through code, for instance, assemble, aggregate multiple elements together. because we've got the code, we're using it in BIM 360 coordinate, we're using it in BIM 360 design. All right, so next aspect maybe, so let's go back here, is the extension manager. So let's say that we have a very complex problem, and yes, BIM 360 is very capable of doing markups and issues and RFIs and what have you, but maybe this is such a complex project that I really need to explain what is happening here. So it requires some sort of video, if you will. So what I'll do is I'm just going to activate some of the subcode here. So I'm going to activate transform. I'm going to activate, and you'll see there's a button here. I'm going to activate markup 3D. And indeed, I'm going to go into this config manager. And the config manager here, it's going to save a sequence of states, if you will. So I'm going to go in here and say, okay, I want to have a new sequence. And I'm going to call this digital twin overview. Digital twin overview, there we go. And actually, this is my first state. So I'm going to save this first state, right? The second state I want to save is actually when I open this wall, and that's going to be my second state. And if I run this now, so there's this play button, it's going to move from state 1 to state 2 to state 1 to state 2, etc., etc. So let's just keep it like that. So I can now go, right, I want to do something more here. This is going to be my third state. And actually, I want to get some information on this element here. There we go. And so that's going to be the next one. So I can go back to my first step. It's going to close everything up. So if I now run this, it's going to say, right, open up the wall, zoom in at the markup, etc., etc. So this is just another example of what we can do with this information. So again, not necessarily the concept of digital twin itself, but it will allow us to enrich our information and make sure that in the end we have an as-built project that we can indeed use for the concept of digital twin. So another one, it's got nothing to do with construction actually, but I like it, and so it's quite cool actually. So I will show it, which is we've hooked up our large model viewer with a gravity engine. So if we're going to be looking at this essentially, so still the viewer, right? And what you'll notice is these blocks, they're not sticking to one another. So if I just zoom in, you'll see there's a bit of a gap there. Okay, so the proof of concept we've done here is, you know, just run it, boom. So you'll notice that if I do a reset, those blocks fall on top of each other, and then well, the rest of the animation continues, right? This is, and again, this isn't really an animation, this is really calculated. So we've got a couple of parameters here. So first step is that I can slow down time dramatically. So let's just do this in slow motion. There we go. And the second aspect is I can actually from minus 9.8 gravity pointing down, I can go to 0. So now we're in mid-space, right? So if I hit run, well, it's still gonna move forward, but there's like no gravity anymore, no more parabolic fall to those elements. But the cool thing is that let's just do a reset here. All of this is still dynamic. So what I can do is if I hit gravity again, then they will start falling, see? So again, nothing to do with construction, but it is quite useful if we're looking at, for instance, applying this in a building and making sure that if we drop like furniture inside of the building, that it will actually stick to the floor, for instance. So that could be an example of it. Right, next piece is, as I mentioned, still Forge. All kinds of developers that have been developing stuff on the App Store. So just Google BIM 360 App Store, you'll get to this one, you select BIM 360 here, and you'll see some of these elements, some of these tools categorized by discipline. So what I can do here is I can go in and say, right, this is actually a tool that we've developed as Autodesk. You might have seen it's free. It connects into any BIM 360 environment, and it allows us to, you know, do some quite intelligent stuff here with the design files. So if I open this link, okay, first thing you'll notice is that it's going to hook up to all of my BIM 360 environments. And yes, I have a couple of them here, but this is the one we're looking at, right? EMEA Technical Sales. BIM 360 FY21, project files, architectural. So this one here, and it has 11 versions, which corresponds to what's inside of BIM 360, of course. It is a single source of truth. So, so that's what we're getting here. Okay. The thing it does is it starts analyzing the metadata inside of my my file. So on version 11, I can actually look at, okay, so for instance, get me all the elements according to level. So I've got quite a few, 120 to be more precise on the third floor, 80 on the second floor, and then entry level 122. So if I want to see them, all I have to do is select them, right? So what you'll see here is, for instance, that we can have a different visualization through a pie chart. So if I want to understand where all the curtain walls are, I can do so as well. So very easy to understand what is happening. This is something that I used with customers where they say, well, we receive, for instance, elements from the architect, and we really want to understand if he filled in the fire rating, for instance. So I can actually go in and understand what the fire rating is on all of those different components. And if there are blanks, then I can find them and eventually send the file back. And remember, design automation, webhooks. So I could actually use this code to say, right, for the architect, the file gets sent into BIM 360, a specific folder where we have webhooks. This code in the background kicks in, analyzes the file and says, oh, there's blank fire rating, and it automatically sends the file back to the architect. That's also a possibility. Okay, so we're almost there when it comes to digital twins. So let's go into where are we? This one. So as I mentioned, we can also do database linking. So let's see where it is. I think I moved across it. Data management. No, not that one. Just bear with me for a second. This one, and then I think it's this one. So Office. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're almost there when it comes to digital twin. So what you'll see here is that we've got an external database, and so we can have all of that cost listed on my different elements, for instance. So what you'll see is that it says here, structural concrete cost in place, concrete cost in place with a certain cost. That's gonna give us the cost of these elements. So if I was to change this in the database, you'll see that when it comes to actually the concrete, it's at 0.11%. So if I change this price in the database, for instance, to 2,500, then you'll see that the concrete cost in place now is 10% of the whole thing. So that's how we can leverage the information inside of the model, hook it up to an external database, and do some analysis with it. All right, so let's move on to the final examples then. And so as you've seen, we've got this whole model now. We've made sure that it is and has built a project. We've got all the tools that we need with the transmittals, submittals, checklists, etc., etc. We get to a model that is fit for use now. So one of the things that we've been playing around with is something that's called Dasher 360. And so what you see here is, again, that very same viewer. And what we have is now a list of sensors, for instance, and I can actually visualize those sensors. And if I want to go in here, I can then say, okay, so show me one of those sensors maybe. So let's take that one, and it's going to zoom in and it's going to tell me, well, here is my specific sensor, for instance, that I can zoom into. And I've got all the information that comes from the environment there. If I go back to my top folder, I can actually say, right, these sensors, that's all of them. So I want to have sensor occlusion. So show me just the ones that I can actually see that aren't hidden behind walls. So you'll see that at the top here, I've got a couple of sensors. I also have my dashboard, which will give me the most critical sensors that I need to look into, or maybe I just want to have a specific view that I can have a look at and, you know, again, specify and look at the sensor information there. Okay. Last aspect is that maybe, let's go back into my building here, top level. Maybe I want to understand how this is moving across time, right? So as I mentioned, a digital twin, it is about getting that information, understanding that information, optimizing our building, but also understanding how our building operates. So with those sensors, what I can do is say, right, actually the actual visualization, that's not of too much importance for me. What I do want to get to is, for instance, this one level, first floor, that I'm going to look into, all of the sensors that are there. And I'm looking at temperature on a 1 hour time base, if you will. So I can just run this and understand what is happening in those different locations, because that information is now hooked up. As you've seen, we can hook up databases to rooms, for instance. We have the sensor information, so we can actually do that here. Maybe I want to understand CO2, quite important these days. So let's have an understanding of CO2 inside of those different rooms, if you will. Okay. And then a last thing I want to show, which is the last example, is one of our partners who have indeed, and I'm just going to go very briefly over it, who have developed this digital twin tool, if you will. This company is called Iviva, and they're again leveraging the information inside of the BIM model. And I'm just going to quickly step through here. And what you'll see is that all of the sensor information again is now tied up into a nice interface, and we can actually control those sensors, or we can control those interfaces from one central location. So we can actually look at incidents here. So if there is an issue at a certain gate in an airport, let's just move forward here. We can look at those different incidents and actually understand, you know, what is happening at that gate. Maybe there's like a fire happening, so we can start switching off the fan, putting on the lights, etc., etc. So again, this is the next step. It's not just understanding the data anymore, it's optimizing the data, but also controlling the information through the digital twin, in this case through a dashboard, if you will, and making sure that we control the actual analog building that sits somewhere on the globe. All right, so that's it for the presentation. So thank you for being here. I'm just gonna quickly look at the questions here. Does cost management have possibilities to connect to ERP? Well, actually, yes, because as I mentioned, we can get through the Forge API, so we can hook it up to just about anything. And another question here is there any loss of associativity between functions if one or more subcontractors are using non-Autodesk software? So that's a very good question. So what I'd say is you can test this yourself actually, because the viewer in its own right is available. So if you go to viewer.autodesk.com, this is where you can test without any cost or whatsoever. You can actually go into upload new file here, and you'll see all the supported file formats. So if one of the subcontractors is using IFC, you can actually test it here. You can drag it in. And my answer is that for those file formats that you see here, depending on the file format, you'll get certain properties. So obviously you're not gonna, the system is not gonna tell you that an AutoCAD block is a door unless you've called that block a door, you know? So what it will do is show you the block information and show you the name, but the intelligence of what the system is showing depends entirely on what you receive. So as I mentioned, a PDF is gonna show nothing. A DWG file is gonna show layers and blocks and the types like polylines and circles and what have you. Revit files are going to show you the Revit families, the levels, etc., etc. So depending on the file format, you'll get different results. But absolutely, you will get all of that information inside of the viewer. But feel free to have a go at it and see what comes up. All right, that's all the questions I have actually, and it is indeed 11 o'clock my time now. So with that, I do want to thank you all for attending this session. As I mentioned, you will get the recording afterwards. If there are any questions remaining, feel free to send them across and we'll have a look at them. Thank you very much.